The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the Cultural Navigator monthly webinar series. This month our feature is Double Click on Culture, Culturally Competent University Graduates. We have about 1 minute before we get started. Welcome, and we'll start in just a moment. All right, we're at the top of the hour. I want to welcome everyone to the monthly webinar series featuring the Cultural Navigator. This month we're focused on developing culturally competent university graduates under the title of Double Click on Culture. My name is Lynn Tarter, and I head up the Solutions Division of TMC of the Litz Company. I'll be your moderator for today's session. And my team member, Letitia Ward, and I will handle all the questions that you type into the chat box, questions box, actually. We're pleased to partner with Dr. Karen Walch and Jeff Santilli today. Our guest speaker and subject matter expert is Dr. Walch. She's an associate professor at the Thunderbird School of Global Management. And Jeff is our Cultural Navigator expert, and he's a master facilitator of the communications programs for Berlitz. So welcome both Jeff and Karen. Thanks so much for joining today. Just a few housekeeping items we'd like to go over with you. First, in order to reduce some background noise during the presentation, all participants will be muted throughout today's webinar. Second, we invite you to use the interactive nature of this interface. So at any time, you can type a question into the question box, and we'll reserve 30 minutes at the end for a moderated question and answer session. Third, we'll be recording today's session, and after the webinar, we will share the link with you by email, back to the email ID you used during registration. Finally, we're letting you know up front that when you switch presenters, we may see a pause in the presentation, so please stick with us. All right. We appreciate that you're here with us today, so let's get started. We'd first like to understand who's on the line with us today. If you could let us know what your organizational role is by choosing from the following option, we'd really appreciate it. So if your organizational role is talent management, organizational development, training, or a business line leader, please choose one of those. If you choose other, please type into the question box what your role is. That will help us tremendously. All right, and let's take a look at the results. And we have quite a sizable population of under the topic heading of others. So we'll take a look at the question box and understand that a little bit more. For the most part, training is the majority. And organizational development is a heavy second place. So thank you so much for joining. We also have some talent management professionals on the line as well. Thanks so much for joining. At this time, I'd like to hand the presentation over to Dr. Walch.
Welcome, everybody, and thank you, Lynn. Welcome to this webinar entitled Double Click on Culture, Culturally Competent University Graduates. And I am Dr. Karen Walch, and I look forward to exploring this topic with you today. And I have worked in the area of cultural competence for 20-some years. And what I'd like to do today is to introduce to you the onboarding system that we use in our university setting and what my experience has been using the Cultural Navigator for our university orientation. We have admissions 2 times a year, and we use this onboarding method when all the students come to campus before they even get into the classes. So what I'd also like to pursue with you is how cultural competence is used in the orientation sessions and why that is here at Thunderbird School. I'm also going to spend some time exploring with you how it can also be used in town halls or large group onboarding systems that many of you might have, or any university or any organization that has to do this kind of facilitation for large groups. I'd like to also explore with you what I've seen as some of the benefits of using the Cultural Navigator for this onboarding. And then I'd like to conclude with some tips for others in designing your own curriculum and how would you embed cultural competency into your onboarding process. So we'd like to actually spend some time right now to do a quick poll, and please let us know how frequently are cultural competence goals embedded in your onboarding or your new hire initiatives. So when you look at the poll, would you please answer always, sometimes, often, rarely, or never? So let's take a look at what are some of the results of this quick poll regarding the use of cultural competence goals included. So if we take a look at the quick poll results, we see that 7% always, 20% often, 33% sometimes, rarely 13%, and never 27%. So we've got a really nice diversity here in terms of how it is used. And what we're going to look at here is how we could increase the goals of cultural competence very early in the onboarding process. Thank you for your replies. So now I would like to briefly outline how I use the Cultural Navigator double-click program in our university orientations when new students come into the program. We basically start out in a very large lecture hall. So in my case, I have about 250 participants, new entering students in both MBA and master's programs. So we'll spend about 10 minutes doing a welcome to the new students, getting them oriented to the various classrooms and methods that we will use. We also start out this program with a role play. And the Terralesian culture role play, well, I have one male student and one female student walk up to the front of the room very quietly, non-verbally, and the woman has no shoes on, and she basically sits down on the floor and serves the man sitting on the seat food or crackers, very non-verbally, in a very sacred way. She's actually feeding him, and then they finish that process. Whenever he's satisfied, they get up and then they walk out, and she will follow him. So at that point, we talk a little bit about what did the people see when they watch that role play, and they're beginning to see that their various filters have a way of defining and judging and evaluating that particular situation. And for the most part, we have a Western mindset and look at the kind of subservient nature of the man versus woman. But in the Terralesia culture, this is basically a situation where the woman is more sacred. She is the only one whose feet can touch the ground. She is the only one who can serve others, can touch the food. So it starts out to be a very active exercise. And the participants then understand that we're going to go into their understandings and their subconscious and to be a little more objective about understanding their cultural filters that they are bringing both to campus and to their new leadership and management positions. So this is basically the welcome and the setup for the session that we will do. So next what we would do is an introduction to the cultural orientations model. And we will use various PowerPoints to outline the cultural orientation model and talk a little bit about the iceberg in terms of this particular session is going to help them focus on the way they think, they believe, and they ultimately behave. And we're looking at what's underneath the subconscious that many of us are not aware of, and how we carry that around as judgments and evaluations when we are doing team meetings, leadership positions, and basically participating in some of the group activities they will be doing on campus. So I will set it in context and look at what are some of the larger social, political, and economic megatrends that are impacting us in leadership today, and the kinds of questions, the kinds of solutions that our generation, this younger generation, is going to have to face. So we'll spend a lot of time looking at the larger context of how turbulent and how uncertain and how intercultural it has become in the 21st century. So then we're going to look at how do we use our own understanding of our cultural preferences, our own training, our own history, and we'll do a very quick COI report survey. This will take probably around 40 minutes, and in the large group setting, we will basically already have them take the COI report. The cohort leaders for each of the teams will have suggested that they take the COI, but all they have to do is bring the COI summary. And then we'll do a quick aggregate survey on a couple of the dimensions. And we'll do a show of hands in the room. And basically we'll start with how many of you are 2 stars on fixed time, how many of you are 1 star, how many are fixed, how many of you are 2 star on fluid, 1 star on fluid, and fluid. So we'll do probably around 5 or 6 of those dimensions, and I asked them to look around the room to see how similar and different they are in terms of their value preferences that are shown in the cultural orientation indicator. Then we're going to take about 10 minutes for them to understand a little more deeply that there's this full resource called the Cultural Navigator that they can use their entire time they are students on campus. And it is on the intranet. They can capture anything out of the Cultural Navigator anytime during their time on campus. So after we basically do a quick survey on the COI, and then we introduce them to the full resource called the Cultural Navigator. This will really conclude the conceptual setup, and now the students are going to receive some instructions on how to do a treasure hunt in the Cultural Navigator. So now we're going to prepare the students for a treasure hunt interactive activity. So in the classroom, I will provide instructions for each of the cohort leaders. We break down the groups, probably about 20 participants in each group with a cohort leader. And those cohort leaders are instructed to give a list of questions to each of their team members. And we tell them that they're going to take these questions and they're going to do a quick treasure hunt in the Cultural Navigator to actually find the answer to those questions. So this takes about an hour for them to walk to a different room because we break them up into smaller groups. And if you have internet capability in one large room, you would not necessarily need to break up the participants, but we have found that it's better to break them up into smaller groups so they can work just on their own team in the Cultural Navigator. So Jeff will now demonstrate how the treasure hunt exercise works using the Cultural Navigator.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Walsh. I'd like to give a demonstration of a few example questions you could use in a Cultural Navigator treasure hunt. So as Dr. Walsh mentioned, this can be useful and informative for anyone who is onboarding new students, new employees, or if you want to expand your current students or employees' knowledge of the resources available in the Cultural Navigator. So in this treasure hunt, I really recommend utilizing questions that focus on the wide variety of information in the Cultural Navigator, and to hone in on the features that you feel might not be being used as much as they could be. So for example, the country guide section is extremely helpful in that it not only provides general country information, but also information about meetings, presentations, management expectations, and other business interactions. So let's take a look at a question that focuses on this information. A little long question, so bear with me for a moment. So one example would be, according to the Cultural Navigator, within the Switzerland country guide, pressure over deadlines is generally resented, especially when time requirements are in conflict with quality requirements, and can create a great deal of frustration. The Swiss are not likely to sacrifice quality and will adjust deadlines if quality threatens to suffer. So in the end, the question is, in which section of the Switzerland country guide can you find more information on this topic? So this really, encourages me as a user to explore the country guides more. When I click on country guides, I can obviously search for Switzerland. And here, it encourages me to explore this a little bit more in depth. So based on the question, I have an idea that it's probably over here in the business interaction section. I'm going to take a guess that it's regarding managing. And since the question was regarding time management, if I click on this, I get more information on the time management expectations in Switzerland. So obviously a question as in-depth as this makes me, as a Cultural Navigator user, realize that the country guides have a great deal of information about other cultures and can help me in my business interactions as well. I can also click Favorite on the Switzerland country guide if I'm going to be in regular contact with this culture, so that it's always only 2 clicks away from me. So let's move away from the country guide and ask a question focusing on the information in our learning section. So for example, within the learning section of the Cultural Navigator, search for an article titled Building Trust from a Distance and read it. Be prepared to share what you've learned. So for this, I have 2 different options, but we can use the general search here at the top. So no matter where you are on the Cultural Navigator, you can always use this search feature. So the article was Building Trust from a Distance, so I'll just search for Building Trust. And here I'm led to this article with more information that can help me answer the question. This really, makes me realize as a user that the Cultural Navigator has interactive learning paths, but it also includes articles, podcasts, and other sources of information. I can also click on Recommend, and everyone who's in my network will see this in their newsfeed on the main page of their Cultural Navigator. So for the final question for this part of the demonstration, I'd also like to focus on the learning section once again. So the question is, the Key Cultural Skills e-learning module discusses which 3 critical skills that characterize the culturally competent manager or employee. So here I could once again use the general search up top of the Navigator, but since I know that it's in the learning section, I'm going to use the search section or function in my learning. So it was key cultural skills, so I'm going to search for that. And based on these results, obviously the closest match is this. So I'm going to click on the e-learning module for key cultural skills, and I can see that the answers here are cultural due diligence, style switching, and cultural dialogue. So if I go further in this e-learning module, I can obviously find out more information about these skills and further my understanding. So I hope that this demonstration has shown you the wide variety of information available to you in the Cultural Navigator. At this point, I'd like to return to Dr. Walch.
This is really great. Thank you, Jeff. So after the students finish their treasure hunt, we give them about probably about 20 minutes, very time, to see how quickly they can find the answer. And then the cohort leaders will actually have them prepare for returning back to the plenary session. And what each of the cohort leaders will do is to ask each team to prepare a summary that they are going to present in a group discussion in the plenary session back in the main room. So each team is going to conclude what the answer to their question is and how they found it, and talk a little bit about the process of using the Cultural Navigator and spending time with the team exploring where they could find some of the answers. So in the large plenary session, we'll probably spend about 30 minutes for each of them to do a very quick presentation. And also in the plenary session, we have the cohort leaders make some comments and summarize on how they saw the teams talking to each other, starting to get to know each other, understand their own cultural approaches toward researching and working together in teams. They start to share their life experiences, their past education, and what they're coming to school for and what their job opportunities are. And many of them talk about how culture is going to be a big part of their leadership goals. So one last activity in this large session is to introduce the students now to the networking function in the Cultural Navigator. Before the teams actually come to this orientation session, one other thing that the cohort leaders have done is to invite each of the cohorts into a team. So each cohort leader will send out an invitation, create a team, and in our case we have each team is named over some southwestern animal like the javelinas or the coyotes. So each team gets a name, and they get invited into that team, and that's all they've done so far is to have accepted the invitation. So now they stay in the large group, and then they go into their small groups right there in the large room, and then start looking at their team makeup. And they will do a team gap analysis, and then they will also do an aggregate report, generate an aggregate report on their own team. So because there's so many people in the room, each of the cohort leaders take the role of keeping everybody engaged and focused on how to use the team aggregate analysis and the team gap analysis. So they will do this team gap analysis and then discuss in their groups where they see some of the gaps, where they see a lot of similarities, and then they begin to discuss strategies for working together, since the cohorts will be connected throughout their 1.5 or 2 years that they're here on campus. In addition, the cohort leaders set them up in the networking function. Not only do they look at their gaps, but they also start to network in the team community function of the Cultural Navigator. So the cohort leaders get the members to be in these teams and communicate throughout their time during the orientation to begin with. But then they also could use this function all the while that they are on campus, and it's a message board for their particular cohort. And then the leaders also go in and summarize the kinds of themes that they see running throughout the communication between the parties. So I'd like to hand over this presentation to Jeff so we could take a closer look at the gap analysis and team aggregate reports and the networking functions within the Cultural Navigator.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Walsh. So as Dr. Walsh mentioned, I'd like to just show you briefly the networking features we have available in the Cultural Navigator. So we were talking about teams and aggregate reports, which if I click on network and I click on a team that I'm already a member of, in this case, I can analyze as a team how, what similarities we have and also what differences we have when working together. So this is the solutions team, in this case, an internal group here at TMC Berlin. And if I click on Team Aggregate Report, then I can see where our similarities and differences are and then plan accordingly so that we can really work together well and find our similarities and really bridge those gaps. It also has more information on the overview, what exactly the aggregate does, what this information means, and I can see where our preferences lie for all of the various dimensions. Another point that I'd like to focus on while we're looking at the network features is both the communities and really our messaging board system available in the Cultural Navigator. So here you can see that we have community discussions, and it's really a great way to stay in contact both with internal people as well as you can get in contact with subject matter experts, etc. So, this is not only you in your silo understanding other cultures, but obviously the Cultural Navigator really encourages interaction with others, whether it be your team or other people that you'd like to be in contact with. So I hope this has been useful information for you. And on that note, I'd like to return to Dr. Walch.
Thank you, Jeff. Done a great job illustrating that function, which is largely overlooked because often we spend so much time on just the cultural orientation indicator, or we spend too much time just looking at the country guides, that this kind of interactive and this way for networking is very important, and I find with my students is a great way for them to start focusing on cultural dialogue, even cultural mentoring with each other, and to sharpen up their focus on the need for cultural due diligence. So thank you, Jeff, for that. So I'd like to conclude our session today with the discussion of how we actually wind up and wrap up these orientation sessions, and also to start taking our conversation into the direction of how we could also assist, and we'd like to hear more about your own onboarding process. One of the things that's very hard for me to illustrate or to demonstrate today just by talking to you is the energy that these really young people bring into a room of 250 people in this large auditorium. So it's quite interesting, first of all, that this generation doesn't like to have much lecture. So the role play to draw them in is useful. A little bit of work on getting them to understand their own assessments and their own tools, which is something we do a lot in the orientation sessions. But then more importantly, to get them engaged in the technology, and they really do like gamification, to put them into a contest. And another thing I should mention, when they do come back, we also have each of the cohort leaders asks how many Cultural Navigator points each team has earned, and then that's announced also in the plenary session. And then we have a determination of who earned the most points. So that's also high energy, and they're all learning their new identity as a coyote or as a javelina. So there's a lot of cheering for their cohort versus another. So that may be particular to a university setting. But that seems as a way to channel all the energy to help them focus, because there's a lot of confusion in that first week on campus. Like all of you, our student, my population is very multicultural, very global. So we got a lot of different languages, different approaches to education and learning. But in general, there's a lot of energy. And this whole session I have with them takes about 3 hours. So what I have learned from this and what the students take away is, number one, they're beginning to learn their own cohort. They're learning to understand direction from the cohort leader, which is going to be their liaison with the campus, at least in that first trimester. It also is useful because it introduces them to the Cultural Navigator and gives them some sense of their own cultural preferences. And we discussed the non-judgmental nature of using that assessment to help them be more observant of their own anxiety and their own judgment when they are working with others. We also explore with them the fact that when they get to the cross-cultural classes and the global negotiation classes, we will spend, as faculty, deeper time in the Cultural Navigator and the real application of their own preferences, how to use the COI as managers, and also how do you apply the skills, the key cultural skills in negotiation, communication, presentations, and various protocol issues that they will face, both on campus, in their group project presentations, and then when they leave campus. So we will give them a chance to understand that they will go deeper into this in their credit courses. They also, in their marketing and strategy, language classes, their regional business environment classes, they can tap into the Cultural Navigator anytime throughout their time on campus in our intranet system. So then we will basically wrap up that program and remind them to contact their cohort leaders for any help that they might have, and that we are resources as faculty as well. So what I have found is that this networking function takes them beyond the actual case example of the orientation, keeps them in that mode of experiential learning and for exchange with each other. And I think this is a great way for organizations to encourage collaborative learning. One of the other things I'd like to just comment on, and I'm sure those of you who do a lot of training and orientations find out that your ideal is always more than you could actually accomplish. So Lynn and I have prepared an ideal version of what you could do in the orientation double-click session. What I had to do was pull out the various pieces as I just spoke to you about, given my time frame, given the kind of other commitments that I had in terms of moving people back and forth in the various rooms. And I guess I would say that plan your ideal and then cut that back a little bit. I find that the greatest objective was to, first of all, get them accessed and introduced and into the Cultural Navigator, and to encourage more time for them to get to know each other while they are learning to use the tool. So thank you so much for participating in this webinar, and I wish you all great luck. And now I would like to actually turn this over to Lynn for a few final remarks and any question and answers that we might have. Thank you, everybody.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Walch, for your time and for your thought leadership here. We really have enjoyed the collaboration to develop this. I would like to conclude with a couple of participant questions, the third and the fourth poll. The third, what is the most exciting to you about the version of the Cultural Navigator that we have demonstrated today? Is it an overall updated look, the ease of navigation, customizable user interface, the updated cultural orientations indicator or our assessments, or perhaps the collaborative learning tools? Go ahead and make your selection, and we'll take a look at our results. Collaborative learning tools being our focus today seems to have the majority of popularity today. Thank you so much for that. I'd like to look at the opposite side. What do you see as perhaps the biggest challenge you'll face in launching the tool in your organization or generating interest and driving usage? Is it having marketing materials, perhaps getting the message out? How would you drive usage of the Cultural Navigator, or perhaps answering questions about the web tool? If you have others, go ahead and use the Q&A box as well, the question box. And let's see what our audience is saying today. Driving usage being the number one. Yes, we've seen that again and again. Thank you so much for that. We have some resources and tools and techniques that we can provide to you for those of you who are looking specifically to drive additional usage of the Cultural Navigator. So in conclusion, I'd like to highlight the 4 key pillars of the Cultural Navigator. Really, we want to focus on the personalized nature of the Cultural Navigator in terms of content. We have learning paths that can be customized to the individual as well. And that's at the individual level. At the collective level, we look at our collaborative learning as a very important element that is built into our learning platform. And the learning online is incredibly relevant to each client and to the organizational level, with customization options and unique features available at a mass level. And then it's representative, for sure, of all of the offerings that we provide, and can be at the organizational level for our clients as well. So if I could draw your attention to the schedule for the upcoming webinars, we have this as a series on a monthly basis. Next month, we are going to focus on keeping learners engaged inside the Cultural Navigator and in general, and drawing them in and continuing to bring them back into the Cultural Navigator next month in March. And in April, we're focusing on supporting an international assignment with the Cultural Navigator. So please join us for those next sessions. We want to thank you for your time today. We hope this webinar has been a true value add to understanding how we can support onboarding and new hire initiatives both at the university level as well as in organizational structures. We have a supporting white paper on this topic, and it's housed in our corporate website, tmcorp.com, and you can click on there for a free download of this white paper. So we are excited to provide that to you. We will put that in the question box for all to see while we are going through the Q&A. Thank you. We now end the recorded portion of today's program and move into the question and answer portion of the webinar. Thank you so much for your participation. Have a great rest of your day.